A lonely sheriff, a laundromat's hum, and a girl with nowhere to go. Secrets unravel in the dark. In Havenwood's still nights, Dan Carver chases a shadow that changes everything. A tale of grief, grit, and unexpected hope. Can one small soul heal another? The quiet town of Havenwood lay hushed beneath a canopy of stars, its narrow streets winding through rows of clapboard houses and shuttered shops, all cloaked in the stillness of midnight. A cool spring breeze rustled the budding maples along Main Street, sending a stray leaf skittering across the pavement, the only movement in a place where most folks had long since drawn their curtains and turned out their lights. In the dead of night, Havenwood slept, save for the faint fluorescent buzz spilling from the 24-hour laundromat, a lone sentinel of life glowing against the darkened storefronts. It was here, in this unassuming flicker, that a mystery began to stir, one that would soon unravel the threads of a broken man's solitude. Sheriff Daniel Dan Carver sat in his patrol car, parked at the edge of Main Street, his weathered hands curled around a chipped ceramic mug of lukewarm coffee. At 53, he wore his years like a familiar coat, comfortable but frayed at the edges, his salt and pepper hair neatly trimmed beneath his hat, his green eyes sharp despite the fatigue etched into their corners. The dashboard clock glowed 11:15 p.m., its soft red light casting a faint sheen across his rugged face, a map of lines carved by time and loss. For 5 years, Dan had claimed Havenwood's night shift, a voluntary exile his deputies were glad to cede. Most had wives, kids, lives that thrived under daylight. For Dan, the night was a refuge, a shroud to drape over memories he couldn't bear in the sun. He took a sip of the coffee, grimacing at its bitter chill, and set it in the console, his gaze drifting to the small photo tucked into the dashboard's corner. A woman with warm hazel eyes, Sarah, smiled beside a little girl with pigtails. Emily, both frozen in a moment, 7 years gone. The car accident that stole them had left Dan a husk, his days since spent avoiding mirrors and mornings, his nights a sanctuary of solitude. He flicked his eyes away, the ache too raw to linger, and scanned the empty street instead. Stray cats prowling, a breeze stirring leaves, Havenwood's pulse a whisper he'd grown to crave. The town was small, barely a speck on the map, its crime a rarity, drunk teens or petty thefts, simple, predictable, a balm to his detachment. The cruiser's engine purred as Dan eased it into gear, beginning his usual loop down Main Street. Closed shops slid past, Havenwood Hardware, Miller's Bakery, their windows dark, their signs swaying faintly in the wind. A neon flicker caught his eye, the 24-hour diner on the corner, its lone waitress wiping counters, and then, a block further, the laundromat's steady hum broke the silence. Its glass front glowed, a beacon in the night, and as Dan rolled past, something snagged his attention, a small figure moving toward the entrance, barely a shadow against the dim spill of light. He slowed, squinting through the windshield, his green eyes narrowing as the shape sharpened into a child. She couldn't have been more than 9, a slight black girl with braids pulled tight under a faded blue jacket a size too big, her thin arms clutching a worn canvas bag stuffed with clothes. Dan's brow furrowed, his foot easing off the gas as she slipped through the laundromat's door, the glass swinging shut behind her. He blinked, the sight jarring in Havenwood's quiet. A kid, alone, past midnight, in a place meant for late-shift workers or desperate travelers. His cop instincts flared, a prickle of unease creeping up his spine as he idled the cruiser, watching the empty street where she'd emerged from shadow. "What's a girl doing out this late?" he muttered, his voice rough in the stillness, fogging the windshield faintly. He considered rolling in, check on her, ask questions, but hesitated, his hand hovering over the gear shift. Maybe she was with a parent, he reasoned. A mom or dad lagged behind, hauling more laundry after a long day. Small towns bred quirks. It wasn't his place to meddle in every oddity. Yet, as he shifted to drive on, those braids, that oversized jacket, lingered in his mind. An image too stark, too solitary, stirring a memory he'd buried deep. Emily's pigtails, her small hands clutching a teddy bear, gone in a flash of steel and glass. Dan shook his head, pushing the thought down, his green eyes refocusing on the road. Probably nothing, he told himself, the cruiser picking up speed as he rounded the corner, the laundromat's glow fading in the rear view. Havenwood's quiet stretched ahead, predictable, safe, a rhythm he'd mastered since Sarah and Emily left him hollow. He'd patrol, check the diner, maybe rouse a cat from a stoop. Simple tasks to fill the hours until dawn chased him back to his empty house. The night shift suited him, its solitude a balm to a heart he'd locked shut, its stillness a shield against the daylight's glare. But that unease clung, a splinter he couldn't pluck, the girl's small frame, her careful steps, alone in a place that shouldn't hold children at such an hour. He glanced at the dashboard photo, Sarah's smile a silent nudge, and his grip tightened on the wheel. Havenwood's low crime didn't dull his instincts. Something felt off, a whisper beneath the town's sleepy veneer. He'd swing by again tomorrow night, he decided. Watch, wait, just to be sure. Little did Dan know, this fleeting shadow in the laundromat's light was no quirk of the night, but the start of a thread that would tug him from his refuge, unraveling a mystery poised to mend the fractures of his soul. The Havenwood night stretched deeper as Sheriff Daniel Dan Carver guided his patrol car away from the laundromat, its fluorescent glow shrinking in the rearview mirror until it was just a pinprick against the dark. Main Street unfurled ahead, empty save for a stray tabby darting across the pavement, its stillness a balm to the unease prickling his chest. His green eyes flicked to the dashboard clock, 11:45 p.m., then to the photo of Sarah and Emily tucked beside it, their smiles a silent pull he shook off with a grimace. The girl from the laundromat, small, braided, alone, had lodged in his mind, her solitary silhouette too stark to dismiss as a quirk of the night shift. He'd be back tomorrow, he'd decided. Watch her, see if she was truly alone, quiet the whisper that something wasn't right. Tuesday night found Dan's cruiser idling across from the laundromat, parked beneath a sagging oak that draped shadows over Main Street's edge. The town slept on, its houses dark, its breeze rustling through budding branches. But the laundromat hummed, a steady pulse of light and sound cutting through Havenwood's hush. He cradled a fresh mug of coffee, its steam fogging the windshield as he squinted through the glass, his weathered hands tightening on the rim. The clock ticked toward midnight, and right on cue, she appeared. A small figure rounding the corner, her faded blue jacket swallowing her thin frame, her braids swaying as she clutched a worn canvas bag stuffed with clothes. Dan's breath caught. She was back, same as last night, her steps deliberate, her head low as if dodging the world's gaze. Lila Jones, he'd named her in his mind. A placeholder until he knew more, her presence a riddle he couldn't shake. He watched as she slipped through the laundromat's door, the bell's faint chime lost to the distance, her silhouette merging with the fluorescent haze. Through the windows, she moved with purpose, sorting clothes into piles, feeding coins into a machine, her small hands methodical, practiced. No parent trailed her, no guardian loomed, just Lila, alone, night after night, a routine that gnawed at Dan's gut. He leaned forward, wiping the fogged windshield with his sleeve, his green eyes tracing her every move. She sat on a bench between cycles, her legs swinging, too short to reach the floor, her bag a makeshift pillow as she waited. The laundromat was empty save for her. No late-shift workers, no stragglers, its hum a solitary soundtrack to her task. Dan sipped his coffee, the bitterness grounding him as questions swirled. Where did she come from, disappearing around that corner? Why here, past midnight, with no one watching over her? Havenwood's quiet was his refuge, its predictability his shield. But this girl's presence cracked that calm, a shadow too persistent to ignore. The next night, he adjusted his route, looped past the diner, checked the shuttered bakery, then parked nearer the laundromat, headlights off to blend into the dark. Midnight struck, and there she was. Lila, her bag heavier tonight, her jacket's frayed cuffs catching the light as she slipped inside. Dan's chest tightened. She was a fixture, her routine unyielding, her solitude stark against the town's slumber. He watched her sort, whites, colors, a tiny pair of socks, her hands steady, her focus unbroken, folding each piece with a care that belied her age. Hours ticked by, the laundromat her domain until the last dryer buzzed, her small form a constant in the glow. Wednesday blurred into Thursday, each night the same, Dan's cruiser a silent sentinel, Lila's presence a ritual he couldn't unsee. She arrived just before midnight, her bag slung over her shoulder, her braids swaying as she emerged from that unseen corner. He'd tried tracing her path once, circled the block, but she vanished into Havenwood's maze, her origin a mystery cloaked by shadows. Through the windows, he saw her wait, sometimes reading a tattered book, sometimes staring at the spinning drums, her stillness haunting, her resilience a quiet force he couldn't fathom. No adult ever joined her, no hint of supervision. Just Lila, night after night. A puzzle Dan's cop instincts refused to shelve. By Friday, whispers reached him. Mrs. Ellis at the diner, wiping counters, had muttered, "That little girl, every night, someone ought to check." Mr. Tate from the hardware store, locking up, had nodded. Seen her too? Odd, a kid out so late. Havenwood was stirring, its eyes catching what Dan couldn't ignore, and their words tightened the knot in his gut. He'd brushed it off at first. Maybe her folks work nights, maybe she's helping. But the excuses frayed with each sighting. She wasn't just washing clothes, she was there, alone, her routine too fixed, too solitary for a town this small. Dan's coffee grew cold as he parked closer that night, the laundromat's hum a siren call, his green eyes tracing Lila's small figure through the glass. She folded a threadbare shirt, her movements slow, deliberate. A child playing at grown-up tasks, her thin frame dwarfed by the oversized jacket. Memories flickered. Emily, 6, giggling as she sorted socks with Sarah. A Saturday chore turned game, sharp and unbidden, cutting through his detachment. He shook his head, shoving them down, but Lila's quiet persistence mirrored that lost joy, tugging at a thread he'd buried deep. Was she scared? Hungry? Hiding? He scribbled notes in his log. 11:58 p.m. Young girl, alone, laundromat. His cop's habit kicking in, though instinct outpaced protocol now. Havenwood's low crime didn't dull his sense. Something was off, a shadow beneath its sleepy veneer he couldn't name. 5 nights, 5 glimpses, and no answers. Her solitude wasn't quirky. It was wrong. He'd seen enough, her nervous glances last night, the way she shrank from the bell's chime, to know she wasn't just helping out. Dan drained his coffee, its grit a jolt to his resolve. Tomorrow, he'd approach, carefully, quietly, her routine a whisper he'd follow until it spoke, a mystery threading through Havenwood's dark he couldn't let slip away. The Havenwood night draped its quiet over Main Street, the stars above faint pinpricks through a veil of clouds as Sheriff Daniel Dan Carver eased his patrol car to a stop across from the 24-hour laundromat. The fluorescent glow spilled onto the sidewalk, a steady hum cutting through the stillness. A beacon he'd watched for 5 nights, each one etching Lila Jones deeper into his mind. His green eyes, sharp beneath the brim of his hat, fixed on the corner she'd emerged from. The dashboard clock ticking toward midnight. 11:57 p.m. Its red glow a silent countdown. Dan's weathered hands rested on the wheel, his coffee cold in the console, his resolve a steel thread woven through the unease that had grown too loud to ignore. He'd spent the day wrestling with it, Lila's routine, her small figure folding clothes alone, night after night. A shadow too persistent for Havenwood's sleepy calm. Mrs. Ellis's mutterings at the diner, that child every night, and Mr. Tate's nod, odd, so late, had echoed his own gnawing doubt, their whispers a chorus he couldn't dismiss. 5 nights of patrols, of glimpses through the laundromat's glass, her braids, her oversized jacket, her quiet precision, had turned curiosity to conviction. Something was wrong. Dan adjusted his hat, his jaw tightening as he stepped from the cruiser, the cool air biting through his uniform. Tonight, he'd approach, gently, carefully, her solitude a whisper he'd coax into words. The street lay empty. No stray cats, no rustling leaves, just the laundromat's hum as midnight struck. Right on cue she appeared, Lila, her thin frame emerging from the shadowed corner, her faded blue jacket swaying as she clutched her worn canvas bag. Dan's breath hitched, her routine unyielding, her small steps deliberate as she slipped through the door, the bell's faint chime swallowed by the night. He crossed the street, his boots scuffing the pavement, his heart thudding. A mix of duty and a flicker he couldn't name, something softer, stirring beneath his cop's armor. The laundromat's glass loomed, her silhouette sorting clothes inside, and he paused, hand on the handle, steadying himself for whatever lay beyond. The bell chimed softly as Dan pushed through, the fluorescent buzz washing over him, harsh against the rows of washers and dryers. The space was near empty. An old man dozed in a corner chair, head lolling, a magazine slipping from his lap. But Lila stood alone at a machine, her small hands measuring detergent with a care that belied her age. She froze mid-pour, her head snapping up, dark eyes wide with a flash of fear as they met his. Dan crouched, bringing himself to her level, his voice low, gentle, a tone he hadn't used since Emily, 7 years gone. "Hello there," he said, tapping his badge with a weathered finger. "I'm Sheriff Dan. What's your name?" "Lila," she whispered, her voice a thread barely audible, her hands clutching a faded t-shirt to her chest like a shield. She took a small step back, the washing machine a barrier between them, her braids swaying as her gaze darted, to the door, to the floor, anywhere but him. Dan's chest tightened, her wariness a jab at his instincts, too skittish, too guarded for a simple chore. "It's okay," he said, palms up, his green eyes steady but soft. "I'm not here to bother you, just making sure you're all right. What brings you here so late?" Lila's lips parted, a breath caught, but no words followed, her silence a wall he couldn't breach yet. Before he could try again, the bell chimed anew, and both turned. A black woman, late 30s, stepped in, her arms laden with a laundry basket. "Hey, Lila!" she called, her voice warm but casual, as she crossed to an empty machine, nodding politely at Dan. Lila's tense shoulders eased, a shy wave and a quiet "hi" slipping out as she shifted away from him, her small hands resuming their task at a corner washer. Dan stood slowly, relief washing over him like a tide. Of course, her mom, he thought, the pieces clicking into place. A parent, a reason, a simple fix to the riddle that had haunted his patrols. He watched Lila move, sorting clothes with that same precision, her focus returning as the woman loaded her own machine, pulling a paperback from her purse. Dan's unease softened, his cop's mind spinning a story. Late-night shifts, a family stretched thin, Lila helping out. A quirk, not a crisis. He'd misread it, he told himself. The town's whispers just idle chatter. Yet, as he lingered, her quick glances, nervous, fleeting, pricked at him, a shadow beneath the relief he couldn't name. Was it shyness, or something more? He shook it off, his boots scuffing the linoleum as he turned to leave, the woman's presence a balm to his worry. "Take care, Lila," he said, his voice a murmur lost to the hum, her head dipping without reply. The bell chimed again as he stepped into the night, Havenwood's quiet wrapping around him, the cool air sharp against his flushed face. He climbed into the cruiser, the engine purring to life, his green eyes lingering on the laundromat's glow, Lila's small figure folding, the woman engrossed in her book. "Just a kid helping out," he muttered, steering onto Main Street, the photo of Sarah and Emily catching the dashboard light. Their smiles a silent nudge he brushed aside. The patrol resumed, diner check, a loop past the bakery. Havenwood's calm settling back over him like a familiar coat. He'd worried for nothing, he reasoned. The girl wasn't alone. Someone knew her, watched her. Yet, as the streets blurred past, that flicker lingered, her wary step back, her silence. A whisper he couldn't quite silence. Dan adjusted his hat, his resolve shifting. He'd keep an eye out, just in case. His night shift of vigil now tinged with a question he hadn't answered. Little did he know, this first approach was a thread pulled, a mystery poised to unravel beyond the laundromat's hum. Sheriff Daniel Dan Carver guided his patrol car back onto Main Street, Havenwood's darkened storefronts sliding past as the laundromat's fluorescent glow faded in the rearview mirror. The night air seeped through the cracked window, cool and sharp, tugging at the edges of his uniform as he replayed the encounter. Lila's whispered, "Lila," her wary step back. The woman's casual, "Hey, Lila," that had eased his mind. His green eyes flicked to the dashboard clock, 12:20 a.m., then to the photo of Sarah and Emily, their frozen smiles a silent tether he brushed aside. Relief had washed over him in that humming laundromat. She wasn't alone, he'd reasoned, but a splinter of doubt lingered, her nervous glances pricking at his cop's instincts like a thorn he couldn't pluck. The cruiser looped past the 24-hour diner, its neon sign casting a faint red sheen across empty booths, then curved toward the bakery, its shutters drawn tight. Havenwood's quiet settled back over him, a familiar balm to his night shift solitude. Yet Lila's small figure, braids swaying, jacket too big, stayed lodged in his thoughts. He'd told himself it was fine, a kid helping a working mom, a late-night chore. But her silence, her guarded flinch, gnawed at him. 5 nights of watching her fold clothes alone, her routine a clockwork shadow in the town's stillness, had built a question he couldn't shake. Was she safe, or had he walked away too soon? Friday night rolled in, crisp and clear, the stars sharper above Havenwood, as Dan parked his cruiser a block from the laundromat, headlights off, blending into the oak-lined shadows. He'd adjusted his route again, closer now, deliberate, his weathered hands cradling a thermos of fresh coffee, its warmth seeping through his gloves. The clock ticked toward midnight, 11:58 p.m., and he waited, breath fogging faintly, his green eyes locked on the corner she'd appear from. Right on time, Lila emerged, her thin frame hunched under that oversized jacket, her canvas bag slung heavy over her shoulder, her braids catching the streetlight as she slipped inside, the bell's chime lost to the distance. Dan's jaw tightened. He'd resolved to watch again, but tonight felt different, the unease a steady drumbeat he couldn't ignore. He stepped from the cruiser, boots crunching gravel, and crossed the street, his shadow stretching long under the laundromat's glow. The bell chimed as he entered, the fluorescent buzz sharp against the quiet, the air thick with detergent and warmth. Lila stood at her usual spot, sorting clothes into a washer, her small hands pausing as she glanced up. Her dark eyes widened, recognition flaring into fear. "Hey, Lila," Dan said, crouching slow, his voice soft as last night. "It's me, Sheriff Dan, just checking in. Everything okay?" She didn't answer, her lips parted, a breath caught, then snapped shut. In a blink, she sprang, grabbing her backpack, shoving clothes inside, darting past him with a speed that stunned him. "Lila, wait!" Dan called, his voice sharper than he'd meant, rising as she bolted for the door. The bell jangled wildly as she vanished into the night, her small figure a blur against the dark. Dan lunged after her, heart pounding, boots slamming pavement. What's she running from? His relief from yesterday shattering as he raced into Havenwood's shadowed streets. She was fast, surprisingly so, her thin legs pumping, weaving between parked cars, cutting through alleys with a grace that defied her size. Dan's breath came in bursts, his uniform snagging on a fence as he followed, her jacket a fleeting blue speck ahead. "Lila, stop! I just want to help!" he shouted, voice bouncing off brick walls, but she didn't slow, her path wild, desperate, pulling him deeper into the town's fringes. Havenwood's quiet broke, dogs barked, a porch light flared. But Lila pressed on, her backpack bouncing as she veered toward the old cemetery, its iron gates gaping like a maw in the night. Dan's chest burned as he closed the gap, the cemetery's edge looming, headstones tilting in the moonlight, shadows pooling thick. Lila slipped through a rusted gap in the fence, her small frame vanishing into the dark, and Dan hesitated, breath ragged, the maze of graves a tangle of risk. "Lila!" he called, voice hoarse, squeezing through after her, the metal scraping his arm. The night swallowed him, moonlight dimmed by clouds, casting shifting patches of gray over mossy stones and twisted roots. He stumbled forward, eyes straining, ears pricked for her steps, panic clawing up his spine. Where'd she go? The cemetery sprawled, a labyrinth of silence broken by his crunching boots, his breath fogging in the chill. "Lila, please, I'm not here to hurt you," he shouted, voice echoing unanswered, swallowed by the shadows. He checked behind a cracked obelisk, peered into a sunken hollow. Nothing, just the rustle of wind through bare branches. His flashlight beam danced, catching a gnarled tree, a leaning cross, but no Lila, her trail lost in the dark. Hours bled together, his legs aching, his calls growing desperate. "Lila, come out!" Until exhaustion sank him against a stone, head in hands, failure a bitter taste. Dan trudged back to the gate, squeezing through, the laundromat's distant glow a taunt as he slumped into his cruiser. His green eyes stung, she's gone, guilt twisting sharp. Had she fallen? Was she hiding, scared? He'd chased her, lost her, a sheriff failing a child he'd sworn to watch. The photo of Emily stared back, her pigtails a silent accusation. "You didn't save me either," and he swallowed hard, shoving it down. "This isn't over," he muttered, voice rough, vowing to find her, to scour Havenwood's edges until she was safe. Unbeknownst to him, the shadows he'd chased held answers closer than he'd dared imagine, a truth poised to break his heart anew. Sheriff Daniel Dan Carver slumped into the driver's seat of his patrol car, the Havenwood night pressing heavy against the windshield, its quiet a stark rebuke to the chaos of his chase. The old cemetery loomed in the rearview mirror, its iron gates a shadowed maw where Lila Jones had vanished, her small figure darting through graves, outpacing him until the dark swallowed her whole. His green eyes burned with fatigue and guilt, his weathered hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel, the cold seeping through his uniform, a bitter echo of failure. The dashboard clock glowed 2:30 a.m., mocking his hours lost among headstones. Her braids, her oversized jacket, a fleeting ghost he couldn't catch. He started the engine, its rumble a low growl cutting through the stillness, and pulled away from the curb, Havenwood streets unfolding in a blur, empty, silent, a town asleep while his mind churned. Lila's flight replayed, her wide, fearful eyes when he'd approached, her sudden sprint from the laundromat, a child running not from trouble, but from him. Guilt gnawed deeper. I scared her, his vow to find her a weight pressing his chest. The photo of Sarah and Emily flickered in the dashboard light, their smiles a silent accusation. You lost me too, and he swiped it aside, shoving the ache down. Tomorrow, he muttered, voice rough. I'll find her, whatever it takes. Saturday rolled in, gray and heavy, the day a restless blur, Dan at the station, poring over records, chasing ghosts. No Lila Jones in school logs, no address, no trace. A child off Havenwood's grid, a puzzle defying his cop's logic. He hit the streets, his uniform crisp, but his eyes shadowed. Mrs. Ellis at the diner, wiping counters, frowned. Poor thing, so tired. Offered her a cookie once. She just kept folding. Mr. Tate, locking his hardware store, nodded. Seen her too young to be out that late alone. Their whispers matched his, concern, unease, a town waking to a shadow he'd failed to grasp. Each word tightened his resolve. He'd watch again, smarter this time, until answers broke through her silence. Night fell, sharp and cold. Havenwood's stars dimmed by clouds as Dan parked his cruiser a block from the laundromat, headlights off, blending into the oak-lined dark. He'd timed it early, 11:30 p.m., determined not to miss her, his thermos of coffee steaming as he waited, green eyes locked on the corner she'd appear from. Midnight struck, and there she was, Lila, her thin frame hunched under that faded jacket, her braids catching the streetlight as she slipped inside, bag in tow. Dan's pulse quickened. She's back, relief mingling with dread as he watched her start her ritual, sorting, washing, folding, alone under the fluorescent hum. He waited, breath shallow, letting the laundromat empty. Mr. Jenkins, dozing in his corner chair, shuffled out, leaving Lila solitary. Her small hands moved slower tonight, her shoulders drooping as she fed coins into a dryer, her routine a weary dance he couldn't unsee. Dan stepped from the cruiser, boots crunching gravel, and crossed to the door, the bell chiming soft as he entered. The air hit him, warm, thick with detergent, and Lila's head snapped up, her dark eyes flashing fear, then recognition. She froze, a t-shirt clutched tight, but Dan raised his hands, voice low, gentle. Lila, it's me, Sheriff Dan. I'm worried about you. Can we talk? Her lips parted, a breath, no words. Then her legs buckled, exhaustion spilling her onto a bench, her eyes fluttering shut despite a fight to stay awake. Dan's breath caught. She curled into her backpack, a makeshift pillow, her thin frame sinking into sleep within moments, her chest rising slow and steady. He stood stunned, the laundromat's hum a roar in his ears. This wasn't chores, it was survival. Her jacket sagged, frayed cuffs pooling, her bag spilling. A blanket, a worn teddy bear, proof she wasn't here to wash, but to stay. Tears pricked his eyes, hot and unbidden, breaking through a stoicism he'd worn like armor for 7 years. Dan sank to the floor beside her, his back against the bench, watching her sleep, small, vulnerable, a child with nowhere else to go. The laundromat's glow bathed her, a silent haven she'd claimed, and his heart shattered. How long? How'd I miss this? Memories surged. Emily, 6, asleep in her bed, Sarah's lullabies, and he choked on a sob, tears streaming silent down his rugged face. For years he'd locked grief away, his night shift a shield, but Lila's quiet struggle cracked it wide. Another little girl, alone, needing what he'd failed to give his own. He stayed, hours ticking by, the fluorescent buzz of vigil's hymn, his green eyes tracing her peaceful face, her braids spilling over the bag. Emily's giggle echoed, "Help mommy, daddy!" And Dan wiped his cheeks, a bittersweet ache blooming where numbness had reigned. This wasn't just a case, it was a call, a child seeking warmth on a bench because the world had left her cold. He'd assumed a mom, a late shift, but this was deeper, a truth he'd chased to its roots. Never again, he whispered, a vow to Lila, to Emily, to himself. He'd guard her, find her story, give her more than a hard seat in a laundromat's glare. Dawn crept through the windows, soft rays brushing Lila's face as she stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Confusion, then fear as they landed on him. "It's okay," Dan soothed, voice hoarse from the night, hands up. "You're safe. I'm not here to hurt you." She sat up, clutching her bag, her gaze darting, wary, searching. But she didn't run, her small frame tense yet still. "Lila," he said, soft, steady, "why are you here alone every night?" Her silence stretched, a wall he'd wait to breach, her presence a haven he'd failed to see, until now, a mystery poised to unravel his own. The first hints of dawn crept through the laundromat's windows, softening the harsh fluorescent buzz as Sheriff Dan Carver, sat on the floor beside a bench, his back pressed against its chipped edge. Havenwood's quiet seeped in with the light, the town still asleep beyond the glass. But inside, Lila Jones stirred, her small frame curled atop her worn backpack, a makeshift pillow she'd sunk into hours ago. Dan's green eyes, red-rimmed from silent tears shed through the night, traced her peaceful face, braids spilling loose, her faded blue jacket pooling around her thin shoulders. Her exhaustion had claimed her mid-task, a collapse that shattered his assumptions, revealing this wasn't a chore, but a haven she'd carved from desperation. Her eyes fluttered open, dark, wide, confusion clouding them as she registered the humming space, then snapped to Dan, fear flaring sharp. She bolted upright, clutching her bag to her chest, her small body tensing as if to flee again. "It's okay, Lila," Dan said, his voice hoarse from the vigil, hands raised in a gentle arc. "You're safe. I'm not here to hurt you." Her gaze darted. Door, washers, back to him, wary, searching. But she stayed, her breath shallow, her stillness a fragile thread he clung to. He'd vowed to find her after losing her in the cemetery, and now, here she was, real, vulnerable, a child he'd failed once, but not again. "Lila," he said, soft as a whisper, leaning closer but keeping his distance. "Why are you here alone every night?" Her silence stretched, a wall he'd waited through the dark to breach, her eyes locked on his, probing, uncertain, as the laundromat's hum filled the gap. Then, a tremor. Her lower lip quivered, her thin frame swaying as exhaustion lingered, and Dan's chest tightened. A pang he hadn't felt since Emily's small hand slipped from his. "You don't have to be scared," he added, his tone steady despite the ache. "I just want to help. You can talk to me." Her grip on the bag loosened, just a fraction, her dark eyes glistening as she swallowed, a whisper slipping out, so faint he strained to catch it. "Gone?" she said, her voice a thread breaking. "She got sick. Really sick. Didn't wake up." Dan's breath caught, the words a blade slicing through. Orphaned, her mother lost, a truth he'd dreaded lurking beneath her solitude. "Oh, Lila," he breathed, his throat raw. "I'm so sorry." He edged closer, his hand hovering, wanting to comfort but unsure, her fragility a mirror to his own buried grief. "What about your dad? Other family?" he asked, gentle, coaxing, his green eyes soft with a sorrow he knew too well. Lila shook her head, a small, defeated motion, her braids swaying. "Just me and Mom," she murmured, her voice cracking. "We came from Haiti. For a better life." Her words faltered, tears brimming as she swiped them with her sleeve, her small frame trembling. A child who'd carried too much, too long. Dan's heart unraveled, Sarah's laugh, Emily's bedtime hugs flooding back, grief mingling with a fierce need to shield this girl who'd lost her anchor. "How long have you been on your own?" he pressed, voice low, steadying her with his calm as her eyes dropped to the floor, her fingers twisting the bag's strap. "Don't know. A long time," she said, her shrug a shield, her words halting but heavy. "Mom said if people found out they'd send me back. I was scared." Dan's jaw tightened. Back where? Haiti? The pieces clicking into a heart-rending picture. An orphaned immigrant, hiding from a world she feared would cast her out. Surviving in shadows he'd patrolled blind. "You've been so brave," he said, fighting the crack in his voice, leaning in as her eyes flicked up, searching, fragile. "More than anyone should have to be. But you're not alone anymore. I'm here to help. Will you let me?" Her silence held, her gaze piercing his, a child's wariness battling a flicker of hope, a question trembling behind her tears. "Why?" she whispered, barely audible, her voice small but sharp. "Why do you want to help me?" Dan froze, the question slicing through. Simple, raw, demanding truth he hadn't spoken in years. He swallowed, his throat tight, and met her eyes, green to dark, a bridge across their pain. "Because," he said, soft, steady, "a long time ago, I had a little girl, Emily. She was 6 when I lost her and her mom. If she were in trouble, I'd want someone to help her. Like I want to help you." His voice broke, tears prickling as Emily's giggle echoed, a memory he'd locked away, now a gift to Lila. Her eyes widened, fear softening, a glimmer breaking through, trust, faint but real, as she nodded, a tiny tilt of her head. Yes. Dan exhaled, relief flooding him, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. She flinched, then stilled, accepting the touch. "How about breakfast?" he said, a warm smile cracking his rugged face. "Then we'll go to the station. Figure out how to keep you safe. Sound good?" Lila hesitated, her lip caught between her teeth, then nodded again. "Okay." Her voice a whisper of surrender, a step toward him. He stood, offering his hand. She took it, small fingers curling into his, her bag slung over her shoulder as they left the laundromat, the bell chiming a farewell to her silent haven. The cruiser hummed through Havenwood's dawn, Lila in the back, her backpack a shield as she stared out the window, stars fading, the town waking. Dan glanced at her in the rear view, her quiet bravery a mirror to Emily's, his heart swelling with a purpose he'd lost. He'd failed once, 7 years ago, steel and glass stealing his family, but not today. Lila's hand in his was a lifeline, a chance to mend what grief had torn, a mystery unraveling into a bond he hadn't sought, but couldn't let slip away. The dawn sky over Havenwood bled soft pinks and golds as Sheriff Daniel Dan Carver's patrol car rolled through the quiet streets, its engine a low hum beneath the waking town. Lila Jones sat in the back, her thin frame hunched against the seat, her faded blue jacket pooling around her as she clutched her worn backpack, her shield, her world, her dark eyes tracing the passing houses through the window. Dan's green gaze flicked to her in the rearview mirror, her small hand's warmth lingering in his from the laundromat, a lifeline he'd grasped after her whispered truth. Mom got sick, didn't wake up, cracked his heart open. He'd vowed to help her, to pull her from the shadows she'd endured alone. And now, as the station loomed ahead, that vow hardened into purpose. He parked in the lot, the cruiser's rumble fading to silence, and turned to her, his voice gentle through the partition. "We're here, Lila, just the station. We'll figure things out, okay?" Her eyes met his, wide, wary, but steady. Her nod a faint tilt, trust flickering fragile but real. Dan stepped out, the morning chill biting through his uniform, and opened her door, offering his hand again. She took it, hesitant, her fingers curling into his palm, and climbed down, her sneakers scuffing the asphalt, her bag slung tight over her shoulder. "It's safe," he reassured, leading her inside. The station's quiet hum, a stark shift from the laundromat's buzz. Her haven no more. The Havenwood police station was still at this hour, its fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow over empty desks. A few early shift officers shuffling papers. Dan guided Lila to his office, a cramped nook with a worn desk, a corkboard pinned with faded notices, closing the door to shield her from curious eyes. "Have a seat," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his, its vinyl creaking as she perched on its edge, her backpack a barrier on her lap. He sank into his own chair, the weight of her story, orphaned, hiding, alone, pressing heavy as he met her gaze. "Lila, I need to know more, to help you right. Can you tell me about your mom, when she got sick?" Her fingers fidgeted with the bag's strap, her eyes dropping to the floor, a long silence stretching before her voice, small, halting, broke through. "A long time ago," she murmured, "we came from Haiti. Mom said for a better life. Then she started coughing. Couldn't work." Her lip trembled, tears brimming as she swiped them away. "We lost our place. Stayed in shelters, but she got worse. They took her to the hospital. She never came back." Dan's throat tightened. Haiti, a better life, gone. Her words painting a child's odyssey of loss, her solitude a shield against a world she feared would deport her. "I'm so sorry," he said, voice rough with emotion, leaning forward as her dark eyes flicked up, searching, raw. "You've been alone since?" She nodded, a small shrug. "Just me? Mom said don't tell. People might send me back." Dan's jaw clenched. Back where? Her fear a dagger twisting deeper, a child navigating Havenwood's edges unseen. "You're brave, stronger than I could have been," he said, his green eyes soft, steadying her. "But you don't have to be alone now. I'm here, okay?" Her silence held, then a tiny nod. Agreement, a crack in her wall he seized like a lifeline. He stood, pacing to the window, Havenwood waking beyond, its quiet streets a world Lila had survived, and turned back, resolve hardening. "We need help, someone official," he said, dialing child services, his voice firm as Monica Reed answered. "Sheriff Carver, I've got a girl, 9, been on her own. Can you come now?" Monica's brisk, "On my way," clicked off, and Dan crouched beside Lila, his hand hovering near hers. "A lady's coming. Monica. She'll talk with us, figure out what's next. You okay with that?" Lila's eyes darted, fear, then trust, her nod slow, her voice a whisper. "Okay." Monica arrived, smart suit, warm smile, her presence filling the office as she sat across from Lila, notepad in hand. "Hi, Lila, I'm Monica," she said, gentle, glancing at Dan with a nod. "Sheriff Dan says you've been alone. Can you tell me about it?" Lila's fingers twisted her strap, her gaze flicking to Dan. He nodded, a quiet anchor, and she spoke, halting, raw. "Mom got sick, died. I stayed away, scared they'd send me back." Monica's pen paused, her eyes softening as Lila's tale spilled. Haiti, loss, the laundromat's refuge, a child's survival laid bare. Dan watched, his chest swelling, grief, pride, a fierce need to shield her. As Monica asked, "What's it like now, with Sheriff Dan?" Lila's face brightened, tentative. "Not scared all the time. He got me a blanket, butterflies." Dan's throat caught. Saturday pancakes, bedtime stories, small acts she'd clung to, a warmth he'd given without knowing its depth. Monica smiled, turning to him. "What's your plan, Sheriff?" Dan straightened, his voice steadied despite the leap he'd taken in his heart. "I want to foster her, adopt her if I can. She needs a home, I'll give it to her." Monica's brows shot up, surprise melting to a nod. "That's big, Sheriff. Possible with work, paperwork, visits, but I see the care here." She stood, outlining steps, temporary custody, assessments, her tone brisk but kind. "We'll start today. Lila stays with you while we process." Dan nodded, relief flooding. She's safe. His vow from the laundromat bench fulfilled, a first step taken. "Whatever it takes," he said, his green eyes meeting Lila's, her faint smile, a spark igniting hope. They left the station, Lila's hand in his, her bag slung over her shoulder, as Havenwood's morning stirred, the sun climbing over rooftops. Dan drove to his house, a modest ranch, its porch creaking under their steps, unlocking a world beyond the laundromat's hum. "This is home," he said, opening the door, her eyes wide at the couch, the kitchen's glow. "Not scared," she murmured, a truth threading their bond, her trust a fragile bloom he'd nurture, a family born from shadows, a vow fulfilled in dawn's light. Sheriff Daniel Dan Carver pushed open the door to his modest Havenwood ranch, the morning sun spilling golden across the hardwood floor as Lila Jones stepped inside, her small hand still curled in his from the station. Her faded blue jacket hung loose, her worn backpack a constant companion slung over her shoulder, her dark eyes wide as they traced the living room's simple warmth. Worn leather couch, a bookshelf sagging with old novels, a kitchen glowing beyond. "This is home," Dan said, his voice soft, steady, green eyes catching hers with a quiet promise. Lila's lips parted, a breath, no words, then a faint nod, her sneakers scuffing the threshold as she crossed into a world beyond the laundromat's hum, her trust a fragile bloom he'd vowed to nurture. Weeks blurred into a whirlwind of steps, paperwork piled on Dan's desk, home visits from Monica Reed, Havenwood's child services guardian, with a sharp eye and warmer heart. Dan threw himself into it, his night shifts traded for days of proving stability. Background checks cleared, his badge a quiet leverage for urgency. Temporary custody held, Lila stayed, her small frame a new fixture in the house, her silence softening into shy glances, her presence tugging him from the grief he'd worn like armor since Sarah and Emily's loss 7 years ago. He'd found her sleeping on a laundromat bench. Mom didn't wake up. And now she was here, a chance to mend what he'd once failed to save. Their rhythm grew. Saturday pancakes, Lila's giggles at his flour-dusted apron, a sound he'd forgotten he could coax. Bedtime stories, her head tilting as he read, The Wind in the Willows, her dark eyes brightening. She'd flinch at sudden noises. Thunder, a slammed door, but lean into his shoulder by the third tale, her trust a slow unfurling. Dan painted her room, yellow, like sunshine, she'd said, her small hands smearing paint alongside his, laughter breaking the quiet. Havenwood watched, a nod from Mrs. Ellis at the diner. "She's lucky, Sheriff." But Dan knew it was he who'd been found. Lila's resilience a mirror to his own buried hope. The adoption hearing dawned crisp and clear. Havenwood's courthouse a squat brick sentinel on Elm Street, its steps slick with autumn dew as Dan led Lila inside. She clutched his hand tighter, her navy sweater, new, hers, swamping her thin frame, her braids neat under a cap he'd bought her. The courtroom hummed, clerks shuffling papers, Monica Reed in her smart suit, and Dan's pulse thrummed, his uniform crisp, his green eyes steady despite the nerves beneath. Judge Evelyn Hart entered, her gray hair pulled tight, her gaze piercing over half-moon glasses as they rose. "All rise," the bailiff intoned, and Lila's grip tightened, her small frame trembling against his side. "We're here for the adoption of Lila Jones by Daniel Carver," Judge Hart began, her voice a calm anchor as she reviewed files. Monica's reports, Dan's testimony, Lila's quiet words at home visits. "Sheriff Carver seeks permanent custody. Evidence and assessments submitted." Dan's throat caught, permanent, a word he'd whispered to Lila over pancakes. "Forever, if you want." Monica stepped forward, her tone measured. "Lila's been alone since her mother's death, undocumented, surviving in shadows. Sheriff Carver's offered stability, care. Temporary custody shows a bond forming." The judge's pen tapped, her eyes flicking to them. Dan's steady stance, Lila's shy trust. "Lila," Judge Hart said, softening, "how do you feel about staying with Sheriff Dan?" Lila's head lifted, her dark eyes darting to him. Dan nodded, a quiet nudge, and she spoke, voice small but clear. "He makes me feel safe. Not scared anymore. I want to stay." Her words pierced Dan, tears prickling as he squeezed her hand. Safe. A gift he'd failed Emily, now given anew. The judge's gaze lingered, then her smile broke through. "Having reviewed all testimony, I approve this adoption. Congratulations, Daniel Carver and Lila Carver, father and daughter." Applause erupted, Monica's clap, deputies' cheers, as Dan swept Lila into a hug, her laugh a melody against his tears, their family forged in Havenwood's heart. They left the courthouse, sunlight bathing the steps as Lila grinned, her first full smile, bright as her yellow room. "What now, Lila Carver?" Dan asked, his heart full, her name, his name, a vow fulfilled. She tilted her head, then beamed. "Can we go to the laundromat?" Dan blinked, surprise curling his lips. "The laundromat? Sure?" She nodded, earnest. "Where you found me, where we started. I want it happy now." His throat tightened, happy, and he agreed, hand in hers, a ritual born from shadows turning to light. The laundromat glowed softer in daylight, its buzz cheerful as they sat on her old bench. No washing needed, Dan's washer at home sufficed, but memory lingered. "Thought this place was just sad," he said, voice low. "But you're right, it's hope, where our story began." Lila leaned against him, her small frame warm. "Scary then, special now, 'cause of you." Dan's arm wrapped her shoulders, tears pricking anew. Emily's giggle, Sarah's lullabies weaving with Lila's quiet strength. A past reconciled in this present joy. Weeks later, they stood in Havenwood Cemetery, Dan's hand in Lila's, her small bouquet of daisies bright against Sarah and Emily's graves. "Sarah, Emily," he said, voice thick. "Meet Lila, she's our daughter now. You'd love her." Lila knelt, placing flowers, her whisper soft. "I'll take care of Dad. We'll take care of each other." Dan's tears fell. Peace, not pain. A bridge between lost and found. Saturdays became theirs. Laundromat visits, a sunshine room, a family forged from Havenwood's quiet, their love a light no shadow could dim. From a laundromat's hum to a home painted yellow, their bond proves even the darkest night's birth hope. Courage can heal, two souls, once alone, now family. Your spark awaits, ignite it. If Dan and Lila's tale moved you, hit that subscribe button. More stories of heart and hope are coming. Like, comment your thoughts or town. I'd love to hear. Let's keep finding courage together. See you next time.